6% of GDP, every 1% of GDP is roughly about 110 million Barbados dollars. So that is the room that we want to make up for the fact that we will lose the level of revenue from taxation that I referred to earlier. But equally, we must also now spend money. So it's a double whammy. You're losing revenue and you're spending additional money that you have not intended to spend when this honorable chamber reviewed these honorable estimates in this house. I spoke to the Minister of Finance from Jamaica today, and he and I both reflected that I don't think we will ever see supplementaries coming as early in the fiscal year as we will now see them. You typically would not expect to see a supplementary before September, October. But we have now to do it. And it is against this background, therefore, that I want to share with you our thoughts. I told you earlier that in discussions with the International Monetary Fund, we've told them that we are prepared to adjust our BERT program to be able to see how we can get greater room. I think we have an initial understanding. No, I think we have an initial understanding that will see us move from 6% to a 3% primary surplus in the first instance, based on the 50% reduction in tourism arrivals, which is the moderate scenario. I've placed this house just now, as well as my team, as well as the International Monetary Fund, that it is looking more and more like the severe scenario and not the moderate. The severe scenario will probably see us go back to reduce even below the 3% to about 2%. But it is too early for us to talk about that. We are going to work in the next 3 months to 6 months on the basis of the moderate scenario until the data comes in. And if we have to adjust, there is an agreement on all sides that we will share and move appropriately to suit. What does that effectively mean? That this gives us the additional fiscal space. That even if we lose $240 million in taxation, tax revenue, that we are hoping to be able still to spend about $150 million over the course of the next 6 to 9 months to be able, and longer because some of the capital projects will go longer than that, but to be able to stabilize and to create opportunities for our people. If the lady who is the waiter or the housekeeper cannot work in a hotel because the tourists are not coming, and she has children, can we find a job for her children's father in construction? Or she may have done tiling before. As I know many a woman who have gone to skills training and done tiling in this country and done welding and done other things. And that more and more you are seeing women and men in the construction industry in Barbados, and competently so as well. So the government would want, first and foremost, in that extra space that we are getting, which is roughly about 350 million, to be able, remember we said that the tax revenue is going to be anywhere between 157 to 240 million dollars in loss, but we want to be able to spend about 150 million dollars over the course of the period of time. And Mr. Speaker, against that background, we also indicated to the International Monetary Fund that we would welcome, as I said, the enhancement of our EFF, the augmentation of our enhanced fund facility by another 200 million Barbados dollars. Interestingly enough, the Minister in the Ministry of Economic Affairs, member for St. Michael South Central, and myself met with the Inter-American Development Bank today, with other Caribbean countries, and with the President of the bank, and they understand that this, and the President of the Caribbean Development Bank, and they all understand that this is a very difficult moment for the region, and that there is need for new policies that hitherto have not existed, and that we need to be able to craft them, because this is like nothing we have ever seen. Indeed, the President, in his wrap-up this afternoon, the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, started his wrap-up this evening by saying, "We have never trained for this." It was a simple statement, but a stark and riveting statement that I will never forget. Similarly, when we met with the International Monetary Fund in conference call on Monday as a region as well, and I met with my colleagues on Sunday evening to prepare for that meeting, we are clear that there are some who need to draw down on the rapid facilities that the IMF have, but that we are saying also to them and to the development banks, we are going to have to go further than what exists in order to be able to fill the gap. Indeed, there is a fund that the IMF established, the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, which was established initially for the Haitians after the earthquake, and then was morphed in to being the unit used to be able to help African countries after the outbreak of Ebola. We have said to the International Monetary Fund, and writing to them as well, to represent as chairman of CARICOM, that we need to be able to create new facilities for this region, recognizing the critical vulnerabilities that we face from climate crisis, the facing of this pandemic, the high debt, and the absolute low growth, and then the security-related issues. Indeed, colleagues may remember that were it not for the pandemic, we would have been having a major regional consultation between the governments of the community, Caribbean community, and civil society in Trinidad in April in order for us to be able to treat violence as a public health disorder. Little did we know that there was another public health disorder that would displace it. We also feel that in the same way that the IMF reviewed the SDR quotas in 2008, 2009 with the financial crisis, that there may be a need to review them, especially for small developing countries like ourselves that are effectively at the front line in every real sense of these crises. And we have also represented generally to all that while the IMF is a lender of last resort, and therefore we can understand insulating them, we may have to start thinking outside of the box and looking at the restructuring of debt, not just for commercial banks and non-financial institutions, but also for development banks, recognizing that development banks were not created when the world had its Great Depression. They were not around at that time. And that for the most part, since the creation of development banks, the world has functioned in a relatively stable economy, even with the oil crisis, even with the financial crisis. But what we see now has no proper parallel. In the last 80 years, 75 years if we take the departure point from the Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations, there's been no similar parallel. And therefore we have to think outside of the box, because mankind will pay what is essential first, and that what we risk is disorderly bankruptcies if we are not prepared to have orderly restructure of debt. And I say so coming from a country that has just come through an orderly restructuring of our domestic and external debt. And for the record, in almost every instance, all the institutions who face restructuring faced a year of losses only to return to a year of profits under this government. I say that for what it is worth. Mr. Speaker, sir, accordingly, over the next 12 months, we will use the additional fiscal space